Tonight we have Michael Kirby to deliver the oration and on the three faces of discrimination: Jews, gays and Koreans. Michael will tie all that together in his unique style. I'm sure he'll make it very challenging and very interesting. But I'd like to say that this is the fifth in the series of the Walter Lippmann oration, and Walter Lippmann was one of the key driving forces in the establishment of the Ethnic Communities Council, and I think that is responsible for Victoria being the home of multiculturalism in Australia. And I think we owe a lot of acknowledgement to our elders, and Walter was one of the key people in that group back in the 60s and the 70s in doing that. A little bit about Michael. He retired from the High Court in 2009. Australia's longest serving judge, one of Australia's preeminent and long-time human rights advocates. Since retirement, he's worked on various global issues of discrimination at the United Nations at the highest level, worked in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, on issues of genocide, crimes against humanity and other terrible wrongs, particularly in Cambodia and North Korea. Chaired the UN Commission of Inquiry on North Korea on discrimination against minorities. We are privileged to welcome Michael this evening. So Michael, welcome to the stage, and we look forward to your contribution this evening. Michael?
Now, I can't stand memorial orations, and when you get to my age, that's just about all that's left for you. Where the person who is being honoured is not even mentioned. I mean, it does happen. People get up and they rave on about what they want to talk about, and they forget that it's a memorial oration. So let us all think about the life of Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann was born in Hamburg in Germany in 1919. So he was born just after the terrible war that inflicted such tremendous suffering on so many people, including in Germany. He was there on the brink of the Weimar Republic. And he had a very ordinary sort of upbringing in an assimilated German Jewish family who were successful in business. And everything was going reasonably fine until 1933, when the Nazis were elected to government, or they got a big vote and they were appointed to government, and Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor, and the Nazis set about policies of sheer hatred, brutality and wickedness against the Jews and also against others in German society, the gypsies, the communists, socialists, gays and other minorities. And fortunately, he and his family realised that the writing was on the wall and that he really had to go. And fortunate was he, but also fortunate was Australia, that he, through some contacts of his family, secured a visa to come to Australia. Now, if you go to the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, as I always do when I'm in Amsterdam, which is very often because my partner is from the Netherlands, you learn how relatively few Jewish refugees Australia took in the 1930s. The refos, we didn't really welcome them. But fortunately, the Lippmann family had the visas. Walter left Germany in 1938. his family left the following year, 1939. They came to Melbourne, and they set up a business in electric lighting. And it was a very successful business, and so successful was it that Walter, by now Walter, had the capacity to spend a lot of time doing the things he really wanted to do, which was learning from his life, learning from what had happened in Germany, learning from the suffering that was to unfold and of which the world became aware. And I think he joined more committees than anybody I've ever heard of. I mean, even more than I've joined committees, and that's an enormous number of committees. He was on everything. He started off really on Jewish committees, and he was in the Council of Australian Jewry, and he was a person who believed in Jewish values and Jewish culture, but he soon extrapolated from the experience. He was motivated to do this because he went back to Germany just after the war, and he saw the terrible devastation of the country of his birth. And he couldn't get back to Australia quickly enough. And he really came to love Australia and what he saw as its values of acceptance and tolerance. Now, we in this audience know that that isn't always true of us. And we in this audience know that we have form on the issue of race. That we in this audience know that we were not really accepting of the Aboriginal people. That is why we acknowledge them on occasions such as this. And that we were not really accepting of people of different race and ethnicity and nationality. It was very difficult to get into Australia if you were of a different race, particularly if you were an Asian or a person from Africa. Two Wongs don't make a white, said Mr. Caldwell, and we all laughed. This was the Australia in which I grew up. Anyway, Walter wrote profusely. He was a very, very busy activist, and he was mainly associated with politics on the Labor side, though he came to realise that in Australia, if you really want to make an achievement from the point of view of civil society, you have to be associated with good people on both sides of politics. And so he became a person who had many friends in political life. Bob Hawke was a very close friend, but earlier than that, Gordon Bryant, whom I knew quite well back in the 70s, and Al Grasby, who was the Minister for Migration, and Gough Whitlam. He was a man who was everywhere because he was in all these committees. And he became the long-time president of the Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria. And he wrote a lot in a journal called Unity. Unity was a journal of the Jewish community in Melbourne, and the lessons that he was trying to puzzle his way through from his life experience and what the world was saying and revealing, the lessons were that civil liberties was very important for Jews, because civil liberties were protective of the distinctive feature of the Jewish community and people who were Jews. And that in supporting civil liberties, you learned not only to protect Jews, but to protect others. And in my life, I've really found that a lot of people, say in the gay community, they only want to talk about gay issues. or Aboriginal people, only want to talk about Aboriginal issues. And we all know one or two feminists who only want to talk about feminist issues. But there is a common phenomenon, and the common phenomenon is stereotyping people and judging people according to a preconceived notion. And he knew from his deadly experience with his family, and that he just escaped in Germany, that stereotyping and attitudes of that kind are extremely dangerous. Civil liberties are good for Jews, but they're good for everybody, and that's why he wrote so much about the importance of civil liberties. He was writing profusely in that period, 1949 to 1951, 53. That was the period of the election of the Menzies government, the defeat of the Chifley government and Dr. Evatt, and the law to ban the Communist Party and the law to the attempt to get that accepted by the High Court, which was unsuccessful. The High Court rejected then the referendum. And having seen totalitarianism up close, Walter Lippmann didn't like it. And it's pretty clear from the passages that he was writing that he was a bit disappointed with the Jewish community, that they were going along with the ban on the Communist Party, and he didn't think that was the way to go. And of course, a lot of Jewish leaders at the time sided with him. Zalman Cohen, for example, who was an up-and-coming law professor, said that the way to beat communists was to beat them with ideas and not to ban them. Anyway, Walter Lippmann continued to give his service. He had married just after the war to Lorna, and she was a very good complement to him because she was a very early herald of the issue of Indigenous people. And this was a wonderful voice that she brought out. She wrote 5 books on the early books on our relationships with the Aboriginal people. And they continued to work for multiculturalism. And he has been denounced. I've seen some very interesting articles which were sent to me denouncing Walter Lippmann as the architect of multiculturalism and the big enemy of white Australia. Well, we'll come back to that, but certainly he was a sort of guru of multiculturalism, and he believed that we shouldn't be trying to make everyone in Australia a white Anglo-Celtic citizen in the South Seas. We should be rejoicing in the fact that we have here a country with probably the most communities from all over the world, and that if we can make it work, then we will be a good example for humanity and for people celebrating difference and not being ashamed or frightened of it. And so that was the central idea of multiculturalism. It was embraced by Mr. Whitlam and most of his ministers, and then it was embraced by Malcolm Fraser. And Malcolm Fraser created, or the Parliament created during his government, the Institute of Multicultural Affairs with Petro Georgiou, a very fine person in public life on the Liberal Party side, and I was appointed to the Council for Multicultural Affairs. So I've also got form in this area, and it goes back to the Malcolm Fraser's government. So let us pause and think of the contribution that Malcolm Fraser and Gough Whitlam, 2 giants and 2 people who really made a contribution to our country. And I'm sure that everybody who's associated with the Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria would like to pass a message to Tammy Fraser, herself a very fine Australian, to express our solidarity with the family and our belief that Malcolm Fraser's contributions will last, and particularly his contribution for multicultural Australia. Now, I'm going to speak about 3 parables, parables from my life. I grew up in the 1940s, and I distinctly remember getting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I remember it because it was printed on a very small airmail paper, and you never saw airmail paper in 1949. It was banned by Mr. Lippmann, the Minister for Post-War Reconstruction, and it had the beautiful language of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so this was a sort of new era. It's very hard to explain to young people today how terrified we all were of the atomic bomb, because we know now that we've survived so far into the current age, but we didn't know that that was going to happen then. And people were really frightened of atomic weapons. Maybe we should get a bit of that fear back again. But this was the world of the post-war era. But haunting everything were those images, the images of General Eisenhower and General Montgomery going to the newly liberated concentration camps that the Nazis had set up in conquered Europe. And then we began to piece together the terrible story that Walter Lippmann would have known intimately, close up. The story of how a killing machine was created to destroy people simply because of they're a bit different, simply because of their ethnicity or their religion. And in the case of the Jews, their ethnicity or religion. In the case of the Jehovah's Witnesses, also their religion. In the case of homosexuals, their sexual orientation. Anybody who was a little bit different was not welcome in Hitler's Germany. And what was unusual was they actually met at Wannsee in 1942, and they planned the destruction of a race. And they pursued that with ferocious energy and great efficiency. But as Daniel Goldhagen has pointed out recently, you don't only do genocide by a killing machine, by an efficient system of ovens and Zyklon B. You also do genocide just by brutal force of killing people with machetes or with knives or hanging them. And half of the Jews and half of the others who suffered under the Nazis were not killed in the killing machine. They were just killed by sheer brute force. And if you go to the Jewish museums in Europe, as my partner and I always do, you learn the terrible suffering of people and, by and large, the indifference of the neighbours. There's a very moving museum in Washington at the moment which has an exhibition just called The Neighbours. And it has photographs of the neighbours looking on as the Jewish people were rounded up in the street. And very soon after, photos of people raiding the houses for their possessions, and then photos of German soldiers coming in and saying, no, you can't do it that way. We've got to collect them and archive them and authenticate them. And all of this is recorded, meticulously recorded. And this was the world that we came up to face when I was a boy of 5, 6, 7, just after the Second World War. And I learned about it in my history. I learned about it from my class on the Universal Declaration. I was taught why we had this Universal Declaration because of the dreadful events that taught us how we had to stop this ever happening again and learn from our history. But at the very time that I was getting those lessons, my partner Jan, as a young boy of the same age as I, going to schools in the Netherlands, got a very particular lesson, of which he told me later. Most of the Jewish people of the Netherlands who were seized were sent to a camp called Westerbork, and that camp was on the railway lines. It all had to do with railway lines. And then they were taken to a camp in what we now call the Czech Republic. Partly it was then Czechoslovakia, German-occupied Czechoslovakia, and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and in the Third Reich it was known as Theresienstadt. It was said to be a step up from your average camp, and that because it was collecting the Jewish people and other people who the Nazis collected from Denmark and from Belgium and from the Netherlands and from North Germany, and they would all be taken to this superior concentration camp, Theresienstadt, now called Terezin. And in that camp, they were given false hopes that actually they were going to be given special treatment, they were going to have homes that they could buy. There were certificates that you could, in the Netherlands or elsewhere, you could buy a home in Theresienstadt, or you can buy property in the land to which they would be sent. They were just being taken out of the German Reich and settled elsewhere. And of course that raised great hopes. But my partner remembers very well being taught by Mr. Claessens in his class in 1948 about two particular events that happened in Theresienstadt. One of the events was an inspection that took place in the year 1944. And the other was an inspection that took place in April 1945. The event in 1944 was an inspection of the camp by the International Committee of the Red Cross. And the International Committee of the Red Cross went to Theresienstadt at the invitation of Himmler, who himself could see the writing on the wall and was trying to place himself in a position that might be beneficial to him if the war kept going badly. And the purpose of it was to check what the conditions in the concentration camps were, and Theresienstadt was the one that was selected. And as many of you will know, there was a whole charade that was entered into. The inspection was conducted by two people from the International Committee of the Red Cross. The chair of the committee was a German Swiss who was known to be sympathetic to the Third Reich, but the French Swiss who was there was Paul Dunant, who was the son or grandson of Henri Dunant, who established the International Committee of the Red Cross in the 19th century. And so when they went to Theresienstadt, they had to walk around the camp, speak to a few chosen prisoners. They had to watch a play called Our Community, which was a sort of play of how beautiful it was in the camp. And they had to watch a soccer match. And all of this was being filmed, and the film was subsequently released for the purpose of trying to demonstrate that actually everything was pretty good and not too bad anyway, given the conditions of the war. And that's exactly what the commissioners wrote, and it's exactly what they reported to the international community. And my partner, remembering this, when I was appointed to the Commission of Inquiry of the United Nations to investigate North Korea, he said, remember Terezin start. Don't you dare walk a red line. Don't you dare omit to speak to anybody who can throw light on it. Don't you go with preconceptions, and don't you give any favouritism, because all those young people who are shown in the movie, Hitler Gives the Jews a New Home, they were mostly taken within days to Auschwitz, and most of them were dead before anybody was watching the movie that was taken then. And Johan said to me, don't you walk a red line, don't you accept the rules that are laid down by those who you have to investigate. There was a second inspection of Terezin start, and it was actually in April of 1945, so the war was really getting close to the end. And on this occasion, they went through the shame charade, right to the very end. People were still being received into Terezin start, and the group came along, they walked the red line, they didn't ask the questions, but this purpose was very specific. It was to take a group of Danish Jews and hand them over to the Swedish Red Cross for the purpose of removing them. And so the people in the camp had to watch as the Danish Jews, I think there were 16 of them in the camp, picked up their humble belongings and got into the bus, along with the families of the SS who were still in charge of the camp. And this, they watched their colleagues going off to freedom, and many of them perished either by the long marches which were imposed upon them, or by sheer starvation and brutality. So that is the world in which I grew up. Now, why did that happen? Why did it happen? What is it about humanity that found the Jews so horrible that they had to be murdered in great numbers and efficiently, so that you could divorce the people from the general populace, from the victims? That's a question I'll leave hanging in the air. Now, as I was growing up, just a bit after I got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I came to a conclusion about myself, and I realised that my sexual attractions were to people of my own sex. I knew that that was a very bad career move, and that I had to keep that very, very, very secret. It was okay if you kept it secret. It was perfectly okay. If you kept it secret, then you didn't require heterosexual people to face up to the reality of your existence. And so long as they didn't have to do that, they were quite happy if they knew that there are those gays out there mincing and prancing, so long as they don't have to think about it. And this was in the minds of Hitler and his lot, but it was also in the minds of most people in Australia. I can tell you, I know all this, I went through all this. It was in the minds of my parents. Made it very difficult to speak to your family, very difficult. And it also made it difficult to speak to your siblings, to friends. It was a very big thing to share that dark, dark secret with anybody. But then there was liberation, and it happened because of a professor of zoology, a man who was an expert in gall wasps, Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey was a man who had millions of samples of gall wasps, all of which he was analysing. He was a crazy taxonomist. He loved to analyse and find out the teeny-weeny little differences of these creatures. And I know somebody who spends his life studying bees. They are very fascinating creatures, and Kinsey was so fascinated by it all, and then suddenly he changed his direction. And he thought, I'm not going to look at bees anymore. I'm bored with bees. I'm going to look at human beings. And so he began to study the sexual behaviour of human beings. And lo and behold, he found that, contrary to what had been generally believed, it wasn't the case that there were just a tiny number of gays. There were lots of them, all over the place. And even people who were basically heterosexual had a number of experiences in their lives which were homosexual experiences. There were some, like me, who were absolutely rock solid, very, very abominable. And there are others who were, a little bit question mark over them, and they were on the scale. And so that was the issue of homosexuality. And it was really a very important issue in my life. And I don't like to say it in an evening which is dedicated to Walter Lippmann, but the Jews are to blame for all this. Because it was in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the Torah. It was there in the early Jewish Testament. And it all started actually in Genesis. So you don't get earlier than that, with the story of Lot. And the story that Lot had received into his home two very beautiful men. They were thought to be angels. And they came into his home, and then a crowd of men circled the home, Lot's home, and they, in the town of Sodom, and they came to the home and they said, we want to get these men because we want to know them. Know in the sense of carnal knowledge. We want to know them. And so Lot said, oh no, they are under my protection and you can't know them at all. But I've got two daughters here who are virgins, and therefore you can have the daughters. They're only women after all, and you've got to leave these men alone. And so out of that biblical story, odd and peculiar as it is, and very odd for us in today's age, with the contempt for women, we have the whole panoply of hatred based on Scripture. And it's still alive and well and doing its horrible work in so many parts of the world. Gays are an abomination, and surely they shall be put to death. We're not talking about something that was just a little bit naughty. This is deadly business. And people actually take all this seriously. I mean, I still have my religion, and I believe my religion is a kind and loving religion, but there are people who just look at the words. I've known a lot of lawyers like that. They're not good lawyers, they're rotten lawyers. Just look at the words. Take the words in St. Matthew's Gospel, which are the foundation of anti-Semitism. When the crowd says to Pilate, crucify him, and he says, well, I find no sin at all, I'm washing my hands about all this, and they say, let his blood be on us and on our children. That's in St. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, and that's the basis of the Christian hatred of the Jews as the killers of Christ. Let his blood be on us and on our children. It's in St. Matthew's Gospel. And how you could interpret the religion of Jesus to take this little passage in a religion which has a lot of messages about love, reconciliation, forgiveness, and take this little passage to not only hate the Jews, but to kill them in large numbers and to regard them as an abomination, you've really got to be a bit weird to do that. But a lot of people, and people today, still say, well, they're the God killers, deicides. The third little parable relates to the story of North Korea, and this came about as a result of an invitation from the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and it was in connection with that invitation that Jan gave me my marching orders. No red lines, just tell it as it is. And so in 2013 I was appointed to chair the Commission of Inquiry, and we knew we would not get into North Korea. I mean, people say, what was North Korea like? I said, we didn't get into North Korea. We never thought we'd get into North Korea. We never expected it. We didn't get in, but we had no problem getting evidence. There are 26,000 refugees from North Korea in South Korea. So there's no problem getting evidence. They came flooding into us. We had them. We had to, in the end, we had to stop collecting the evidence, or we couldn't have written our report in the space of the 1 year. Well, actually, it was 7 months that we had to write it. And so we decided to do our inquiry in a very different way. The UN, being mostly populated by people of the civil law tradition, do their inquiries normally in the manner of the civilian legal systems, the system basically derived from France. It's very efficient, it's very quick, and it's a bit authoritarian, but it gets things done. And it's usually done by professors in the United Nations. Well, this time they had myself and the former Attorney General of Indonesia, Marzuki Darusman. So we two, who had actually had experience in courtrooms, were asked to investigate it, and we did. But we did it in a different way. We held public hearings, and we filmed the public hearings, and we had transcripts prepared of the testimony, and we put all this online, the films, the transcripts, and it's all out there. When you go home tonight, you can Google it, and it's very powerful stuff, because we had learned from Nuremberg. We had learned from the public affirmation of accountability of people who do very wicked things. And so the testimony that we got told of many great wrongs to human rights. I never thought in my life, as a person whose life was basically of an Australian lawyer and judge, that I would ever have to sit and hear about things just like what General Montgomery and General Eisenhower saw, about a man whose humble job was to wheel a wheelbarrow into which he would wheel around the camp and pick up the emaciated bodies of the starved prisoners or detainees who had died overnight, put them into the wheelbarrow and take them to a vat, put them into the vat, light the fire, burn them, take the ashes and the bones and the pieces of human body that had not been burnt, and scatter them on the nearby fields for fertiliser. But that's what we got in our testimony. And we found so many instances of discrimination. Discrimination against people on the basis of their social class. This is a regime that has a system of law called Songbin, and Songbin means class or category. There are 51 categories. This was invented by Kim Il-sung, the first of the Kims. And the categories classify people as basically either the elite, the core class, or the wavering, those who you can't really trust, and the hostile class. So most of them are not to be trusted. That's the classification. And if you are born into the core class, then your life isn't too bad. But if you're not, then you are really suspect, and any infraction is very grievously punished, and many of you end up with your family in the detention camps. We had a lot of testimony about the issue of women. They have a racial purity idea. This is a very common thing in totalitarian regimes, and the racial purity was the notion that if you have a baby by a Han Chinese, then you are breaking the rules of the society. Discrimination against people on the grounds of religion. The Christian religion was 23% of the population of North Korea, as it still is of South Korea, but now it's less than 1%. So we had all these instances of discrimination. And why do they do it? And this is the question that we all have to answer. And I think the answer is discrimination of these horrible kinds, whether against Jews or against gays or against people in North Korea, is based on an infantile attitude that everybody has to be the same. This is not the infant school, this is the big world. And what we have to do in our world is to expose this, to reason about it, and to call to account those who are responsible for the great crimes that occur. And that is what the Commission of Inquiry did. And I have to tell you, as fellow citizens of Australia, you hear a lot of criticism of the UN, and I've voiced some of it myself. But on this instance, this was a case where the United Nations did absolutely everything that should have been done to render accountable those who are guilty of the great crimes that were revealed in our report. So basically that's what I came to tell you, and I think if Walter Lippmann were here tonight, he would be glad that we have reflected upon the contemporary relevance of the matters to which he dedicated his life.